Elias Brandale Reven stepped off his carriage, only to find himself dumbfounded, frightfully staring at the scene in front of him. Spread out in front of his eyes was a mountain of rubble. It was hard for him to believe that this was the capital. It would have been more believable if someone had told him that this was all an illusion, but that was not the case. The scene in front of him was the truth, the conclusion of the battle. Marquis Reven's expression contorted at the sight of the tragedy in front of him. How much manpower and time would have been necessary to ruin a city as large as the capital to this extent? Either quantity would be unimaginable to him. The only one with the power to realize this was the Sorcerer King, who could only be described as inhuman. The footsteps behind him got closer as a voice began to speak to him. Marquis. It was a noble from his own faction, one that had accompanied him on his way here. Although he was a mere baron, Marquis Reven held his abilities in high regard. It was to the extent where he had planned to raise this man's title before anyone else. For that reason alone, when asked by the Sorcerer King's subordinate which of the nobles were outstanding enough to spare, this man was the second person he named. Not even such a distinguished man could bring himself to speak, because he too could not hide his fear, and so they quivered. He must be experiencing the same emotions as Reven himself upon witnessing the scene in front of him. Marquis Reven looked back and confirmed that all 12 nobles had descended from the 10 carriages. Our audience awaits. No one objected, and that was to be expected. They had been summoned to this place by the Sorcerer King, so there was no way they would still be able to say things along the lines of "let's not." They could not even muster that much courage in the first place. No, it was more accurate to say that none of them were so foolhardy. The problem now was, they had been told to come to the capital without a specified location. Marquis Reven looked around to discover a still-standing structure far away. The palace. The castle grounds, meant to serve as the palace's defenses, had been rendered to rubble too. The reason why Marquis Reven could spot it from where they were was probably because they had cleared out the rubble around it on purpose. A sole structure amid a mountain of rubble. Reven had not given this proper thought beforehand, but this was no salvation. On the contrary, it had become an item that inspired an unspeakable and violent disgust in those who saw it. Let us proceed. Marquis Reven's entourage was currently at the ruins of what used to be the capital's walls, so the palace was quite a distance away from them. While it might be faster for them to ride over, they had to avoid being seen in their carriages for fear of disrespect. They were there early for the scheduled time for their audience anyways, so they could make it there with plenty of time left, even if they walked the entire way there. Marquis Reven stumbled around as he walked forward. Was this that street? He heard someone behind him mutter. The main street towards the palace was free of rubble. It was so clean that it was probably swept before this. In other words, the only thing that remained intact here was the street. None of the houses nor the walls to the sides of the street remained. It seemed likely that they were demolished and then burned clean. On their way to the capital they had seen villages and cities that were destroyed too, yet none of them matched the extent of destruction on display in the capital. Marquis, the capital's inhabitants. Speak of this no more. They must have been worried about the safety of this city's residents. However, Reven had not heard of them being relocated, nor had he seen refugees outside of the capital. Given that was the case, there could be only one fate for them. Marquis Reven looked to the ruins to his sides. How many people were buried underneath? He even felt as though he was walking through a giant graveyard. Reven no longer used his nose to breath because he did not want to smell the pungent smell of corpses. But, miraculously, there was no such scent at all. The only smells that lingered in the air were the unbearable scent of burnt items and ashes. They had walked for some time now but were still far away from the palace. With their hearts weakened by the sight of such tragedy, Reven heard someone mumble. Mad King. Marquis Reven immediately turned around and yelled. You bastard. His sharp gaze circled around the nobles, of which there was one whose complexion was pale, and whose face was constantly twitching. Those who had lived long enough as nobility would have learned to subdue their emotions just to hide their expressions, yet the sight in front of him still made him yield internally. He could empathize with them, but even if he concurred with that thought, they were here. It would not be advised to make an enemy out of them, so he had to vocally rebuke them. You all are phenomenal talents, that was why I chose to save you, so try to avoid squandering my efforts through such gaffes. There is no need to apologize to or thank me. Just please try to understand where I am coming from. No responses, but he had faith that his intentions were well conveyed. Marquis Sama. If we just walk without talking, our minds would naturally become occupied by depressing thoughts. How about we speak of some positive topics as we walk along? That is a good suggestion. Then, shall we talk about the birth of my second child? The nobles congratulated him in unison. In these past few miserable months, to Marquis Reven, this was the only good news that triumphed overall. That was why he had spoken to them of this topic multiple times already. He would praise his child for hours on end, but what he talked about was mostly without substance. However, considering the fact that it could alleviate the mood a little, he still spoke of his child. When he snapped back to reality, they had already walked halfway on the long road to the palace. Perhaps he might have said a bit, indeed, only a bit, too much. Though he still had so much more to say, he knew it was time for him to stop. Revan purposefully faked a cough. Everyone who had tuned him out already tensed up at this. Well then, we shall speak more of my child when we return. What should we propose to the Sorcerer King so that our children may live happily in the future? They had discussed this topic many times before arriving here, but it was about time that they reached a conclusion. Marquis Revan surveyed their surroundings to confirm that there were no soldiers from the Sorcerer's Kingdom around. Well, this is a question we must face straight on. His Majesty the Sorcerer King is undead after all. Unlike living beings like us, his rule will be everlasting. Will our grandchildren and great-grandchildren forget this scene and do something to enrage His Majesty? That is highly likely. Though our grandchildren may do fine, those that come after them worry me. After all, idiots could inherit the role of family head. Honestly, we do not have to take that much responsibility. If push comes to shove, why don't we just allow them to perish? Grant them a quick death. A speech that would shock anyone who took pride in their noble bloodline, was made by a female lord whose family had only ascended to landed nobility during her father's generation. She was here as a representative of her sick father. Because it had come from someone whose roots in nobility did not run that deep, many had put on displeased expressions. Look at what is in front of you, things would not end with just one's family being slaughtered. Revan's words made her cast her gaze to the ground. So that is why these are the only things we could do. Have this tragic scene drawn for posterity and tell our children of what happened here. We will have to beg His Majesty the Sorcerer King to preserve this scene. Were we not supposed to build a new city on these grounds? Revan heard a question from his right, which was met with a rebuttal to his left. Rebuild this when it has been ruined to this state. Do you not find that a bit hard to imagine? Marquis Revan agreed with the latter. However, the Sorcerer King possessed power that neither he nor the entire human race could muster. Perhaps he wished to build his ideal city from the ground up, and that was why he had done what he did. But, if they lingered on this thought, they would get nowhere. Also, what about the hostage situation, Marquis? This was the topic he hated the most. Revan bit down on his lower lip. They were not sure if the Sorcerer King would demand hostages from them, but, compared to the other parties suggesting this, it would be more favorable for them to propose this idea. Marquis Revan racked his brain and arrived at a conclusion. I will be the one to suggest the proposal to the Sorcerer King. In other words, he was advocating that they actively hand over hostages. Many of the nobles probably disagreed with his decision in their hearts, but none of them spoke up nor changed expressions. After they had made their final decisions on a number of subjects, the palace finally came into view. What Revan and the rest saw was a mountain of rubble that appeared to be blocking the entrance. Perched atop it was an undead being. The undead was conversing with the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, Albedo. Perhaps they had detected their presence because they turned to face them. There was still a bit of distance between them, but Revan and his entourage began to sprint. Once they got closer, they finally figured out the true form of the mountain of rubble the Sorcerer King sat on. Well, it would be incorrect to call it a true form, because it was indeed a mountain of rubble, yet from a different point of view it was not. Placed on top of it was something radiant. The crown of the kingdom. That was a throne made of rubble, an art-piece symbolizing the end of the kingdom. It was hard for them to imagine that the rubble that constituted this throne was from this city. Perhaps it had been transported over from some enviable place. Terrifying. A monster who was capable of conceiving such an idea and could also execute it as is, was terrifying. They ran with all of their might and took a knee in front of him, almost as if they had tripped over. Huo, huo. They heaved, terribly out of breath. We are here to pay our respects to your Majesty the Sorcerer King. Marquis Revan bowed and felt the Sorcerer King glance at the back of his head. Revan, correct. You made it here just in time. That said, how should I put this? Regulate your breath first. You have worked up quite a lot of sweat after all. Tutu has shown such a disgraceful sight to you, I must profusely apologize. His voice was laced with so much familiarity that it shocked him. That was exactly why he was terrifying. His brain screamed the word trap to him. Their situation would only worsen if they kept up their unkemptness. Revan pulled out a handkerchief to wipe the sweat from his forehead. I summoned you all here after all, etiquette would dictate that I greet you first. However, I dislike meaningless chatter, so let us be prompt. Understood. Was he about to speak to Revan and the others about something they had not discussed before? The Sorcerer's Kingdom's army had destroyed the land of the nobles to the west and to the south of this city. They will be returning soon. You all should administer to your lands as usual. Although we might alter territorial designations in the future, we have not planned to do so yet, am I correct, Albedo? Yes, it is just as Ain-sama had surmised. That is about it. From now on, Albedo will notify you of any important changes we might make to your domains. You should follow the same laws you have been up to this point. Not just Revan, but the other nobles piped up to respond too. Do you have any questions or things that you are confused about? None at all. It is just that, to prove mine and my fellow nobles' loyalty, your servant I would like to make a few proposals. Makir even spoke as though he was coughing up blood. After he had said these words that gave him depression, he saw that the Sorcerer King had turned his head to look at something distant. He might be thinking something along the lines of mere humans dare to speak to me, other than to answer my questions. Such arrogance. Had he displeased him? Revan felt as though his stomach had been filled with lead. If he were about to be done with grueling work, only to have his subordinate add more documents to the pile, he would probably be making a similar expression to the one the Sorcerer King had on right now. Revan thought about these things in a vain attempt to escape reality. After what felt like an eternity had passed, the Sorcerer King lazily spoke. Is that so? Just speak to Albedo after this. That concludes this conversation then. Right, to allow people to realize how idiotic it would be to oppose me in my country, this place will be left in its current state. That said, if some plague were to be born from this, it would be quite troublesome. For that reason, we will be applying magic here after burning it through and through. To avoid getting caught up in that, remember not to allow anyone near here. Understood. Albedo, summon Gurren Hiran, burn it all to the ground. However, the palace's beautiful exterior must be preserved. Move the furniture and whaten it inside to Irantal. Understood. Although he wanted to know who Gurren was, it was probably something not meant for his ears. If he had to categorize things into should know and should never find out, everything surrounding the Sorcerer King probably belonged to the latter. Now then, although the kingdom had been utterly destroyed, Revan, I must ask. The true extent of how moronic it would be to oppose me must be common knowledge by now, correct? Yes. The fact of how foolish it would be to oppose your highness the mighty Sorcerer King will surely become common knowledge for eons to come. Because his head was bowed, he could not tell what expression the Sorcerer King had. Of course, the Sorcerer King did not have any skin, and thus no expression to speak of, but he could sense a hint of joy in his response. Is that so? Then what we have done here was worth it. I am rather satisfied because of that. Hearing the opinions of the Sorcerer King, one who had slaughtered 8 million of the kingdom's people, gave Revan an intense urge to vomit. He could not help but pray that one day a hero would slay this demon king.